The forest didn't make a sound when the portal opened. That was the first sign something was wrong. Normally, when reality tore itself open, there was noise, crackling air, screaming physics, the violent protest of a universe being forced to bend. But here, in the woods outside Gravity Falls, the portal arrived silently, like a thought slipping into someone else's dream. A green spiral unfolded between the trees, glowing faintly against the darkening sky. Leaves froze in mid-fall. A squirrel stopped running, suspended for half a second longer than it should have been. Then Rick Sanchez fell out of it. He hit the ground hard, rolled once, and groaned, pulling himself upright with visible irritation. His flask slipped from his coat and clinked against a rock. Stupid calibration, Rick muttered, wiping dirt from his face. I told you, Morty. He stopped. Morty wasn't there. Rick blinked, looked behind him, looked at the portal, which was already shrinking, its edges flickering unpredictably. That's not good. The portal collapsed with a soft implosion, leaving behind nothing but normal air and an unnatural stillness. Rick pulled out his scanner, tapping it with annoyance. No signal, no return trace, no multiversal echo. He frowned. What kind of backwater dimension doesn't leave a trail? The scanner beeped again, this time faster. Rick's eyebrows lowered. The readings were off the charts, but not in any familiar way. Not radioactive, not demonic, not even properly quantum. It was layered, as if multiple impossibilities were stacked on top of each other, barely pretending to coexist. Rick looked around. Tall pine trees surrounded him, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. The forest felt dense, but not wild, more like it was watching, like the land itself was aware of visitors. This place smells like secrets, Rick said quietly. He took a step forward, then stopped. The ground beneath his boot felt resistant, not physically, but conceptually, like the universe had briefly questioned whether he was supposed to be there. Rick grinned. Oh, I like you already. He walked deeper into the forest, scanner humming non-stop. Every direction registered anomalies, temporal hiccups, probability knots, spatial inconsistencies that shouldn't exist in a single location. This wasn't chaos. It was curated. Somewhere nearby, an owl hooted, but the sound echoed twice, slightly out of sync. Rick paused. That's cute, he muttered. Echo delay in natural acoustics. Someone's been messing with causality. The trees opened up, revealing a dirt road leading toward a small town nestled between hills. Warm yellow lights flickered in windows as evening settled in. A sign stood at the roadside. Welcome to Gravity Falls. Rick stared at it. Gravity Falls, he repeated. Yeah, that tracks. As he stepped onto the road, the scanner spiked sharply, then stabilized, as if the town itself had acknowledged him. At the exact same moment, miles away, another machine reacted. In the basement of the Mystery Shack, Ford Pines was hunched over a work table covered in blueprints, notes, and strange symbols. His instruments, normally quiet, suddenly burst into life. Dials spun wildly. Lights flashed red. A low alarm began to hum. Ford straightened, heart pounding. No, not again. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the readings. This wasn't the familiar signature of Bill Cipher. No dream energy surge. No mind wave distortions. This was something else. Clean, precise, aggressively intelligent. A technological rift, Ford whispered, but far more advanced than anything I've seen. The anomaly wasn't spreading. It was walking. Ford grabbed Journal 3, flipping through pages until he reached a section he had hoped never to update again. Unclassified visitors. Back on the road, Rick continued toward town, increasingly annoyed. Every time he tried to open a portal, the gun fizzled. The energy dispersed into harmless sparks, like the universe was politely declining his request. "Wow," Rick said. "You've got boundaries. That's adorable." He passed a rusted sign advertising a tourist trap, the Mystery Shack. Next. Right. Rick snorted. Of course. As he approached the edge of town, the air changed. It felt heavier, like stepping underwater without the pressure. His coat fluttered slightly, though there was no wind. The scanner let out a long, continuous tone. Rick stopped walking. For the first time since arriving, he felt it. Something ancient. Not watching him. Noticing him. Rick slowly lowered the scanner. "Oh," he said softly. "You felt that too, didn't you?" Somewhere far beyond the visible sky, beyond dimensions that refuse to obey Euclidean geometry, a triangular eye opened. Bill Cipher smiled. Not because he recognized Rick, but because the universe had just done something interesting. The town of Gravity Falls did not announce itself loudly. It never had. Rick noticed that immediately as he crossed the invisible boundary between forest and civilization. There was no sudden shift, no dramatic change in scenery, just a subtle tightening of reality, like the air itself had decided to pay closer attention. Streetlights flickered on one by one, but not in sequence. Some hesitated, others brightened too quickly, then dimmed, as if correcting themselves. Rick watched this with mild interest, his scanner now useless, its display reduced to a static blur of overlapping readings. Yeah, Rick muttered. "You're complicated. Join the club." A car passed him on the road. The driver slowed, stared a little too long, then accelerated away. Rick smirked. "Right, I'm the weird one." As he walked, his shadow stretched unnaturally far across the pavement, splitting briefly into two before snapping back into one. Rick stopped, looked down, and sighed. Okay, that's new. He crouched and tapped the ground with his knuckle, solid, normal. But underneath it, layers. Something old woven into the structure of the town, like bedrock, carved with invisible equations. Gravity Falls wasn't built on mystery. It was built around it. Rick straightened and continued, following instinct more than direction. Every step forward felt oddly permitted, like the town had decided he could stay. For now. Inside the Mystery Shack, Ford Pine stood perfectly still. The alarms had stopped, but the readings remained. Stable. Locked. Whatever had entered Gravity Falls wasn't fluctuating anymore. It had adapted. Ford adjusted a dial, frowning. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Interdimensional incursions destabilize local space-time. They don't integrate." His eyes drifted to a corkboard covered in notes about Bill Cipher. Symbols, warnings, diagrams mapping the triangle's influence. This wasn't that. Bill tore reality open like a wound. This presence moved through it like a scalpel. Ford felt a chill crawl up his spine. Above him, the shack creaked, a familiar sound, a comforting one. But beneath it, he could feel the town itself humming, subtly, like a machine running in standby mode. Ford grabbed his coat. "If you found this place," he said to the empty room, "then you're either very lost or very dangerous." Rick reached the edge of the main street just as a loud crash echoed from somewhere nearby, followed by excited shouting. He turned to see a group of small figures dragging something far too large for them. Gnomes, by the look of it. Bearded, pointy-hatted, arguing loudly about whose fault it was. Rick stared. They stared back. One of the gnomes squinted. "Is that a tall, hairless gnome?" Rick sighed deeply. Okay, nope, not doing this. He raised his portal gun and fired. Nothing happened. The gnomes gasped. Ooh, one whispered. He tried magic. Rick lowered the gun slowly, eyes narrowing. You guys are real. The gnomes puffed up proudly. Rick rubbed his temples. Great. I'm in a mythologically dense pocket universe with local reality suppression and hostile cuteness. The gnomes lunged. Rick reacted on instinct, pulling a small device from his coat and tossing it at the ground. A pulse of energy rippled outward, not destructive, just disorienting. The gnomes froze mid-charge, blinking in confusion, then scattered into the bushes, yelling about curses and bald giants. Rick watched them go, unimpressed. Biological anomalies stabilized by belief, he muttered. Low threat, high annoyance. But his hand lingered on the device longer than usual, because something about that encounter bothered him. Not that gnomes existed. Rick had seen worse. It was that they fit. They didn't glitch. They didn't resist his presence. They behaved like they belonged here, fully supported by the local rules. And Rick didn't. Not yet. Across town, Ford felt it too. A brief spike. Not on his instruments, but in his gut. He's interacting, Ford whispered. The system's responding. Ford had spent decades studying gravity falls. He knew how the town behaved when disturbed, how it lashed out or concealed itself, or quietly erased problems. It wasn't doing any of that. It was observing. Rick reached the mystery shack, just as the last of the tourists were leaving. He stared up at the crooked building, taking in every uneven plank, every mismatched nail. This thing violates at least 6 zoning laws, he said. I respect that. As he stepped onto the porch, the scanner finally stabilized. One clear reading appeared. Anomaly source, human. Rick blinked. That's flattering. Inside, Ford paused mid-step as a strange sensation washed over him. Not fear, not danger. Recognition. Not personal. Intellectual. Ford smiled despite himself. Oh, he said quietly. So that's what you are. Somewhere far above Gravity Falls, beyond stars and stories, Bill Cipher watched the town with renewed interest. His eye followed Rick's movements like a chess player, studying an unfamiliar piece. A scientist, Bill hummed, but not my kind. He laughed softly. Let's see what you break. Rick pushed open the door to the mystery shack. A small bell jingled above his head, its sound lingering half a second longer than it should have. Rick glanced up at it, unimpressed. Of course you're cursed too. Inside, the air smelled like dust, pine resin, and something faintly electrical. Shelves overflowed with obviously fake artifacts mixed, carelessly, with items that were very much real. Rick's eyes flicked from object to object, instantly sorting the nonsense from the genuinely dangerous. A shrunken head that was definitely alive. A compass that didn't point north, south, or anywhere sensible. A snow globe humming softly with trapped spatial distortion. Rick stopped walking. Huh. That caught his attention. This place is a mess, he muttered, but it's an organized mess. He stepped farther inside, boots creaking on the wooden floor. The shack felt like a disguise, loud, ridiculous, intentionally sloppy. But underneath it, Rick sensed a deeper structure, like reinforced concrete hidden behind carnival paint. Someone had built this place to look stupid. That meant they were smart. From the back room, Ford Pines watched through a crack in the doorway, heart pounding. The man who had just entered the shack moved with careless confidence, like someone who assumed the universe would get out of his way. And worse, the shack wasn't rejecting him. Ford's defenses, wards woven into the walls, Symbols etched beneath the floorboards were responding, but not aggressively. They pulsed softly, adjusting themselves around the intruder. Adapting. That shouldn't be possible, Ford whispered. Rick paused near a display of haunted objects, his gaze locking onto the wall behind it. He tilted his head. There, he said. Ford stiffened. Rick walked closer and knocked twice on the wall. The sound was wrong, too hollow, too clean. You've got a subspace pocket back here, Rick said casually. Low-grade concealment, but stable. Nice work. Ford stepped out into the open. You shouldn't be able to sense that, he said. Rick turned slowly. Two men stared at each other. For a moment, the universe held its breath. Rick took in Ford's posture, the ink stains on his fingers, the way his eyes kept darting, not nervously, but calculating. Ford took in Rick's lab coat, his unsteady stance, the sharp intelligence behind the slurred confidence. They recognized each other instantly, not as friends, not as enemies, as equals. Well, Rick said, breaking the silence, either you're the janitor with a hobby, or you're the reason this town hasn't collapsed into a screaming paradox. Ford adjusted his glasses. And you're either very lost or very irresponsible. Rick grinned. Yeah, that sounds about right. The wards hummed softly around them, uncertain. Ford gestured toward the back room. We should talk somewhere more secure. Rick followed without hesitation, already scanning the walls, the ceiling, the floor. His scanner flickered weakly, still confused, still constrained. As they entered the hidden laboratory, Rick let out a low whistle. Okay, he said. You definitely earned the paranoia. The lab was a patchwork of science and symbolism. Oscilloscopes next to ritual circles. Equations scribbled beside warnings written in languages Rick hadn't seen in a while. Hybrid defense model, Rick said. Science backed by belief-based reinforcement. Sloppy execution, but clever. Ford bristled. Sloppy? Rick waved a hand. Relax. I've seen worse. I've done worse. Ford folded his arms. You opened a portal into a protected anomaly zone. That alone puts you on my list of serious threats. Rick shrugged. Your zone pulled me in, not the other way around. That made Ford pause. Rick continued, tone shifting slightly. Less mocking, more curious. This place interferes with portal harmonics, dampens exit vectors. That's not accidental. Ford's eyes narrowed. You understand interdimensional physics. Buddy, Rick said, tapping his temple. I invented better versions of it drunk. The room fell quiet. Ford felt a strange sensation, relief mixed with dread. Then you know what lives here, Ford said carefully. Rick's expression hardened just a little. I know something notices intrusions. Old thing, likes attention, doesn't play fair. Ford exhaled slowly. Bill Cipher, he said. Rick blinked once. Oh, a triangle. Ford frowned. You've heard of him? Rick scoffed. Not personally, but I've seen the type. Reality parasite. Runs on narrative weight and psychological leverage. Ford's grip tightened on the edge of the table. He nearly destroyed this town. Rick leaned back against a console, arms crossed. Yeah, he said. And now he's curious. As if summoned by the words, the lights flickered. The temperature dropped a few degrees. Somewhere in the shack, a laugh echoed faintly, warped, distorted, like a memory being played backward. Rick's scanner shrieked once, then went dead. Ford swallowed. He knows you're here. Rick smiled, but there was no humor in it. Good, he said, because I don't like being studied. High above Gravity Falls, beyond stars and dimensions stacked like broken glass, Bill Cipher floated lazily. hands clasped behind his back. "Well, well," Bill sang, a walking apocalypse with a lab coat. His eye narrowed with delight. This town just got interesting. And Gravity Falls, the town that watched monsters come and go, tightened its grip on reality just a little more. The laughter faded, but its absence was louder than its presence. Rick stood still, head tilted slightly, as if listening to a frequency only he could hear. The lab lights stabilized, though they remained dimmer than before, as if the building itself was conserving energy. "Yeah," Rick said quietly. "He's definitely a show-off." Ford didn't respond right away. He was watching symbols carved into the walls, protective sigils he had etched years ago. They were still glowing faintly, but the glow was thinner now, stretched, like a shield under pressure. "He hasn't manifested like that since before Weirdmageddon," Ford said at last. "If he's reaching out again, it's because the environment changed," Rick cut in. "Predators don't wake up unless the ecosystem shifts." Ford looked at him sharply. "You're calling yourself an ecosystem shift?" Rick smirked. "I prefer invasive species." Silence settled between them, thick with unspoken calculations. Two minds racing ahead, already predicting outcomes neither wanted to say aloud. Rick broke it first. "Your town," he said, gesturing vaguely upward, "isn't just weird. It's reinforced, anchored. Someone or something built safeguards into the idea of this place." Ford nodded slowly. "Gravity Falls sits on a nexus, a natural convergence point for anomalies. I spent years trying to contain it." Rick snorted. "Containment's cute. You should try pressure redirection." Ford frowned. "Pressure from what?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He walked to a chalkboard and wiped away half a dozen equations with his sleeve, replacing them with his own symbols. Loops inside loops, arrows that curved back on themselves. "From me," Rick said finally. Ford stiffened. "You're saying your presence alone is destabilizing the town?" Rick glanced back at him. "I'm saying the universe doesn't like when someone shows up who refuses to play by the local narrative." Ford absorbed that in silence. Outside, the town of Gravity Falls continued its nightly routine. Streetlights buzzed, doors locked, curtains were drawn. But beneath the mundane rhythms, the town's deeper mechanisms were stirring, old wards adjusting, ancient symbols realigning. Gravity Falls was adapting. Rick felt it too. For the first time since arriving, he felt resistance pushing back, not aggressively, but firmly, like a hand on his chest, saying, "Don't go further." He grinned. "Oh, you're alive," he murmured. "That explains a lot." Ford watched at him carefully. "You're enjoying this." Rick shrugged. "I enjoy puzzles. This place is one big passive-aggressive riddle." Ford hesitated, then spoke more softly. "You should leave." Rick raised an eyebrow. "Can't." Ford's eyes widened slightly. "Your portal gun." "Locked out," Rick finished. "This town's running interference on exit vectors. Smart move, by the way. Keeps gods from popping in and out." Ford's stomach sank. "Then you're trapped." Rick considered the word. "Nah," he said. "I'm delayed." The shack creaked again, deeper this time. A low hum vibrated through the lab, not loud enough to alarm, but persistent enough to be noticed. Ford swallowed. Bill's attention always comes at a cost. Rick nodded. "Yeah, he's gonna poke. Prod. See what breaks." Ford clenched his fists. "We barely survived him last time." Rick's expression softened, just slightly. "Then you learned. That's the difference between survivors and victims." The hum grew louder. Rick's scanner flickered back to life for half a second, displaying a single warning before going dark again. Narrative instability detected. Rick laughed quietly. Oh, that's new. Ford stared at the display. What does that mean? It means, Rick said, this place runs on story logic more than physics. Ford nodded grimly. That's Bill's domain. Rick shook his head. No, that's everyone's. He turned toward the door, already thinking 3 steps ahead. Your town tells a story. Heroes, mysteries, lessons, closure. Ford followed his gaze. And you don't? Rick's smile faded. I end stories, he said, usually badly. Outside, a cold wind swept through Gravity Falls, rattling signs and whispering through trees. The sky darkened slightly, though no clouds moved. Somewhere between dimensions, Bill Cipher twirled lazily, humming to himself. Well, now, he said, this is going to be fun. His eye flicked toward Gravity Falls, then beyond it, toward infinite realities stacked like books on a shelf. A scientist who doesn't believe in destiny, Bill chuckled, in a town that runs on it. He clapped his hands. Let's see which one cracks first. Back in the shack, Ford felt the weight of inevitability settle over him. If Bill escalates, I'll handle him, Rick said. Ford looked at him sharply. You don't know him. Rick met his gaze, eyes sharp, sober for once. I know his type. The hum stopped. Wards flared once, then steadied. Gravity Falls held. For now. Rick stepped toward the door, coat fluttering slightly as caught in an unseen current. Well, he said, guess I'm staying. Ford exhaled slowly, knowing deep down that nothing in Gravity Falls ever stayed simple for long. Outside, the town continued breathing, watching, waiting, and far beyond the sky, something ancient smiled, because the portal that shouldn't exist had already changed everything.
Morning came to Gravity Falls the same way it always did, reluctantly. Fog clung to the streets like an afterthought, refusing to burn away even as sunlight crept over rooftops. Birds chirped, but their songs overlapped strangely, some notes repeating twice, others arriving just a fraction too early. Rick noticed all of it. He stood on the roof of the mystery shack, coat flapping slightly in the cool air, staring down at the town like a problem that didn't want to be solved. Yep, he muttered. Definitely sentient adjacent. Below him, Gravity Falls went about its business, tourists wandering, shopkeepers unlocking doors, kids biking past as if the universe wasn't quietly recalibrating itself around one drunken scientist. Rick took a long drink from his flask. Inside the shack, Ford hadn't slept. He sat at his work table, surrounded by fresh notes scribbled through the night. Diagrams layered on top of older diagrams. Warnings rewritten with sharper language. Every instrument he owned told the same story. Rick Sanchez was not destabilizing Gravity Falls. Gravity Falls was responding to Rick Sanchez. That's worse, Ford whispered. Rick dropped through the attic hatch without warning, landing lightly despite appearances. He glanced at Ford's notes, immediately understanding them. Ah, Rick said. You figured it out. Ford didn't look up. You're not an anomaly here. You're a catalyst. Rick grinned. I get that a lot. Ford finally met his eyes. This town has survived beings that bend reality through sheer will. Demons. Entities. Gods, pretending not to be gods. But you, I don't pretend, Rick finished. I measure. Ford's jaw tightened. They moved outside together, walking down the main street as the town slowly woke. Rick's presence caused subtle ripples. Electronic signs flickered. Glass warped slightly under his reflection. Shadows lagged behind their owners by half a step. None of it dramatic. All of it wrong. Ford pointed discreetly. That didn't happen yesterday. Rick shrugged. You get used to it. They stopped near a small park. Rick crouched, placing a device on the ground, a simple disc, unassuming. He tapped it once. The world hesitated. For exactly 3 seconds, Gravity Falls revealed itself. Lines shimmered through the air, probability paths, narrative anchors, symbolic load-bearing points. Buildings glowed faintly where belief reinforced structure. The mystery shack burned brightest of all, a knot of intention and secrecy. Then it vanished. Ford staggered back, breathless. You just peeled back the rules. Rick stood, unimpressed. Yeah, and they peeled back harder. Ford stared at the device. You shouldn't be able to do that without tearing the town apart. Rick's expression shifted, curiosity overtaking arrogance. That's what's bugging me, he said. From somewhere deep beneath Gravity Falls, something shifted. Not Bill. Something older. The town shuddered once, like a muscle flexing. Rick looked around slowly. Okay, that's new. Ford swallowed. You're provoking defensive responses. Rick snorted. I exist. That's enough. They returned to the shack as clouds gathered overhead. Thin, geometric clouds that bent unnaturally at the edges. Symbols flickered briefly in the sky before correcting themselves. Bill Cipher watched from nowhere and everywhere. He didn't intervene. Not yet. This wasn't his game anymore. This was research. Rick spent the next several hours doing what Rick did best, breaking things without meaning to. He ran scans through the shack, through the forest, through the town itself. Every test revealed the same impossible truth. Gravity Falls operated on dual logic, physics, and story. Events didn't just happen because they could. They happened because they made sense. Rick hated that. You can't quantify irony, he snapped, pacing the lab. You can't stabilize coincidence. That's cheating. Ford watched quietly. And yet, it works. Rick stopped. You've built a system where belief reinforces structure, Rick said slowly. That means attention equals power. Ford nodded grimly. That's how Bill operates. Rick laughed, sharp and humorless. Yeah, well, that's how I operate too. Difference is, I don't need an audience. The lights flickered again. This time, a voice followed, not loud, not clear, just amused. Rick froze. Ford felt it immediately. The pressure behind the eyes, the faint distortion of thought. Careful, Ford whispered. That's how he starts. Rick closed his eyes. For a brief moment, the universe bent inward. Rick saw equations collapse into symbols. Logic spiraled into metaphor. The edges of his mind pressed against something vast and laughing. Bill's voice brushed against his thoughts like static. You're not supposed to be here. Rick smiled. Oh, buddy, he whispered back. That's my line. The pressure snapped. Windows rattled. The shack groaned. Somewhere outside, a flock of birds took off all at once, screaming. Ford grabbed the table to steady himself. What did you do? Rick exhaled slowly. I looked back. High above Gravity Falls, Bill Cipher recoiled, not in pain, but in surprise. No one ever looked back. Not like that. Rick wiped his mouth, suddenly sober. Yeah, he said. This is going to get messy. And Gravity Falls, the town that thrived on weirdness, braced itself, because science had just noticed the madness, and madness had noticed science. The day did not proceed normally after that. Gravity Falls tried to pretend it was fine. Shops stayed open. Tourists kept buying souvenirs. Children laughed too loudly, as if sound alone could reassure the universe that everything was still in place. But beneath it all, the town was thinking. Rick felt it while pacing the lab, an almost imperceptible pushback against his movements, like walking through water that didn't want to ripple. "You're overcorrecting," he muttered to the air. "Relax." "I'm just passing through." The air did not relax. Ford watched Rick work with growing unease. He had seen obsession before, in himself, in others. But Rick's focus was different. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't curiosity for curiosity's sake. It was irritation, like someone had challenged the rules without realizing who wrote them. Rick sketched rapidly on the board, equations bleeding into diagrams, diagrams looping back into equations. Half of them made no sense to Ford. The other half made too much. "You're trying to force linear causality onto a nonlinear system," Ford said carefully. Rick scoffed. "I'm trying to prove it should be linear." "And if it isn't?" Rick stopped writing. Then he erased the board in one aggressive sweep. "Then the universe is cheating," he said flatly. Outside, the sky dimmed again, subtly, like a theater adjusting its lights before a scene change. The shack's wards flared briefly, reacting not to an attack, but to anticipation. Ford swallowed. "He's watching again." Rick nodded. "Yeah, I felt him lean in." For the first time since arriving, Rick didn't immediately respond with mockery. He stood still, eyes unfocused, listening, not with his ears, but with the parts of his mind tuned to catastrophe. Bill wasn't pushing. He was waiting. That was worse. Rick slammed a device onto the table. "Okay, fine. If this place wants narrative, I'll give it data." Ford frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I stop poking. Randomly," Rick said, already assembling components, "and start testing him." Ford stiffened. "You're proposing to provoke Bill Cipher." Rick shrugged. "I provoke everything. Difference is, this time I'll be measuring the response." Ford hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "What do you need?" Rick paused, surprised. "You're helping?" Ford met his gaze. "I've spent my life running from him. If there's a way to understand how he reacts to you, I won't waste it." Rick smirked. "Careful. That's how people end up like me." They moved outside as the sun dipped lower, painting the town in amber light. Rick planted small devices at key locations, near the forest edge, the water tower, the mystery shack itself. Each device hummed softly, barely noticeable. To everyone else, they were nothing. To Bill, they were irritants. The first response came gently. A street sign rotated 90 degrees on its own. Rick noted it. Low energy manipulation. Spatial humor. The second response was louder. Gravity reversed for half a second. People screamed, then laughed, convinced it had been a trick of balance or imagination. Rick scribbled notes. "Mass influence without structural damage. He's conserving effort." Ford's voice was tight. "He's playing." The third response was personal. Rick felt it before it happened, a cold brush against his memories, a familiar weight pressing on old wounds. Beth's voice echoed faintly in his mind. "Why weren't you there?" Rick staggered back, teeth clenched. Ford caught his arm. "Rick!" Rick tore free, eyes blazing. "He doesn't get to do that." The sky cracked. Not visibly, but conceptually. For a heartbeat, gravity falls existed in two versions at once, one safe, one screaming. Then Rick snapped his fingers. A pulse rippled outward from his devices, scrambling thought space, severing Bill's grip. The town shuddered. Windows shattered. Car alarms wailed. Rick stood in the center of it all, breathing hard. Bill laughed. Not out loud. Inside the cracks of reality. "Oh, you're fun." Rick wiped blood from his lip. "Yeah," he muttered. "I get that a lot." Ford stared at him in horror and awe. "You just blocked him." Rick shook his head. "No, I annoyed him." The difference mattered. Darkness crept in faster than it should have as night fell. The stars above Gravity Falls rearranged themselves briefly, forming patterns that meant nothing and everything. Ford felt the familiar dread settle in his chest. This is escalating. Rick nodded grimly. Yeah, he's shifting tactics. The air grew heavy again, but this time it wasn't Bill alone. Something else was stirring. The forest at the edge of town whispered, not with words, but with pressure. Old symbols buried beneath the soil glowed faintly, reactivating. Gravity Falls was mobilizing. Rick noticed immediately. "Oh," he said softly. "You've got auto defense." Ford followed his gaze. "The town protects itself when threatened." Rick smiled, genuinely impressed. "That's incredible." For the first time, Rick Sanchez looked at Gravity Falls not as a problem, but as a collaborator. High above, Bill Cipher scowled. The town wasn't supposed to fight back, and it definitely wasn't supposed to side with the scientist. Bill's eye narrowed. "Fine," he growled. "If you want a story." The stars flickered. "Let's make it a tragedy." Night settled over Gravity Falls like a held breath. Not sudden, not dramatic, just inevitable. Streetlights hummed a little louder than usual, their glow stretching farther than physics allowed. Shadows pooled in corners where they didn't belong, bending inward as if listening. The town wasn't panicking, but it wasn't relaxed either. Rick felt it in his bones. "This place is bracing," he said quietly. Ford stood beside him on the shack's porch, watching the tree line ripple faintly, as if the forest itself were adjusting its stance. "Gravity Falls has survived worse," Ford said, though his voice lacked conviction. Rick snorted. "Yeah, but not worse like this." Ford frowned. "What do you mean?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He pulled another device from his coat, sleeker, heavier, humming with contained power. He didn't activate it. He just held it, like a threat the universe could sense. "Most cosmic entities," Rick said slowly, "play one game: power, fear, control. They want obedience or chaos." Ford nodded. "Bill thrives on all three." Rick's eyes stayed on the forest. "Yeah, but he also thrives on meaning. That's the weakness." Ford stiffened. "Meaning?" Rick turned to him. "Bill needs things to matter. He's chief. Narrative weight. You stop feeding that, and he..." Ford. "We tried ignoring him. It didn't work." Rick smiled thinly. "Because you ignored him emotionally, not structurally." The ground beneath their feet vibrated, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. Somewhere in town, glass chimed softly, as if struck by an unseen hand. Rick exhaled. There it is. From the shadows between the trees, something moved. Not Bill. Not directly. A shape formed where the forest thinned. A distortion that looked like a man until you tried to focus on it. Then it became wrong. Too many angles. Too few. Ford froze. "That's one of his constructs." Rick tilted his head. "No," he said. "That's a probe." The thing stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel that didn't exist a moment ago. Its face shifted constantly, sometimes human, sometimes geometric, sometimes a blur of static. It spoke. "You don't belong here." Rick yawned. "Join the line." The construct lunged. Rick flicked his wrist. The device in his hand pulsed once, releasing a silent wave that passed through the entity like a ripple through smoke. The construct froze mid-stride. Then it unraveled. Not exploded. Not destroyed. Deconstructed. The shape collapsed inward, folding into nothing like a bad idea abandoned halfway through. Ford stared. "You erased it." Rick shook his head. "No, I proved it was unnecessary." The forest stilled. Somewhere, Bill Cipher screamed in irritation, not in sound, but in structure. Reality bent sharply, then snapped back. Windows across town cracked at the same time. Rick winced. Okay, he didn't like that. Ford swallowed. You're pushing him. Rick nodded. That's the point. They returned to the lab as alarms began to chirp, not loud, but persistent. Instruments Ford hadn't activated flickered to life, reacting to something moving through the town rather than into it. Ford scanned the readings. He's shifting influence vectors, less direct interference, more indirect pressure. Rick leaned over his shoulder. He's outsourcing. Ford's eyes widened. To what? Rick didn't answer. The answer arrived on its own. Across Gravity Falls, people began acting off. A shopkeeper rearranged shelves into strange geometric patterns without realizing it. A tourist stared too long into a mirror and forgot what he'd been looking for. A child laughed at nothing, then cried without knowing why. Bill wasn't attacking the town. He was editing it. Ford clenched his fists. He's embedding himself into daily life. Rick's jaw tightened. Yeah, he's turning the town into a broadcasting medium. The lab lights flickered again, and this time they didn't stabilize. The walls stretched slightly, then corrected themselves. The symbols carved into the floor glowed brighter, struggling to maintain coherence. Ford whispered, "He's testing our limits." Rick laughed softly. "Good." Ford snapped his head toward him. "This isn't funny." Rick's smile faded. "No, it's familiar." He leaned against the table, suddenly looking very tired. Every universe has a point where logic stops being enough, where reason alone can't win. Ford hesitated. "And what do you do then?" Rick stared at his reflection in a warped metal panel. "You cheat," he said. Outside, the sky twisted, clouds forming a massive, imperfect triangle before dissolving. People noticed this time such. Fear spread, not fast, but deep. Gravity Falls responded. The forest brightened faintly with hidden runes. The shack's wards flared fully for the first time in years. Old mechanisms beneath the town shifted, grinding like ancient gears being woken from sleep. Rick felt it and grinned. "Oh, you've been holding back," he said appreciatively. Ford looked around in awe. The town is activating all safeguards. Rick nodded. Because it finally knows what it's up against. High above, Bill Cipher floated, arms crossed, eye narrowed. "Well now," he growled, "that's just rude." He snapped his fingers. The stars rearranged themselves again, but this time they stayed that way, forming a pattern. A message. Rick's scanner screamed as it translated the impossible. Escalation confirmed. Rick sighed. "Yeah, that tracks." Ford turned to him, fear and resolve mixing in his eyes. "What happens now?" Rick looked out at the town, at the lights, the forest, the fragile balance between absurdity and annihilation. "Now," Rick said, "science stops pretending it's polite." The ground shook once. Deep, final. And somewhere between equations and nightmares, the real conflict began to take shape. The night finally broke. Not into dawn, but into motion. Something fundamental shifted beneath Gravity Falls, like a lock turning after centuries of rust. The town didn't scream, it didn't fracture, it decided. Rick felt it instantly. "Oh," he murmured. "You've crossed your threshold." Ford steadied himself as instruments spiked all at once. The town is reallocating energy. Defensive systems are no longer passive. Rick grinned. "Good. Passive never wins." Outside, the forest moved, not physically, but intentionally. Paths subtly realigned. Landmarks drifted just enough to confuse intruders. Roads curved where they hadn't before, redirecting flow like a living maze. Gravity Falls was no longer just reacting. It was strategizing. Bill Cipher sensed it too. For the first time since Rick's arrival, Bill's laughter stopped. "That's new," Bill muttered, eye narrowing. "Very new." He drifted lower, closer to the conceptual edge of the town. Not entering, just hovering at the boundary where rules blurred. Rick stood at the center of the lab, surrounded by humming devices and glowing sigils. He wasn't rushing anymore. Every movement was deliberate. "Bill's used to chaos," Rick said. "He's not used to resistance with structure." Ford nodded slowly. "The town is limiting his influence." Rick shook his head. "No, it's reframing it." He activated a central console. A holographic model of Gravity Falls rose into the air, twisting layers of reality, symbolic nodes glowing where belief reinforced physics. "This town runs on shared expectations," Rick continued. "Mystery, curiosity, survival through weirdness." Ford stared. "You're mapping narrative force." Rick smirked. "Don't tell anyone." The model flickered as Bill pushed back. Parts of the hologram warped, turning sharp, mocking. Bill's voice echoed through the lab, not loud, but unavoidable. "You think you can outthink me?" Rick didn't flinch. "No," he said calmly. "I think I can outbore you." Ford blinked. "Out what?" Rick adjusted a setting. Across Gravity Falls, something strange happened. Nothing. No distortions. No whispers. No sudden horrors. For several long seconds, the town was just normal. Bill froze. His influence, spread thin across daily life, found nothing to hook into. No reactions, no fear spikes, no wonder. Rick had synchronized his tech with the town's defenses, damping narrative fluctuations. Coincidences flattened. Irony collapsed. Story momentum stalled. Bill snarled. "You're suffocating the fun." Rick nodded. "That's the idea." The pressure in the air intensified as Bill tried to force a reaction. A clock melted briefly, then snapped back. A reflection smiled when it shouldn't, then corrected itself. Gravity Falls rejected the edits. Ford watched in awe. The town is enforcing consistency. Rick's expression was sharp. Consistency kills cosmic tricksters. Bill's eye twitched. He changed tactics. The world tilted, not physically, but emotionally. Doubt seeped into the town. Subtle, insidious. People felt uncertain without knowing why. Ford staggered. "He's shifting to psychological influence." Rick clenched his jaw. Yeah, that's his comfort zone. For a moment, even Rick felt it, a familiar weight pressing down. The quiet voice that asked why he bothered, why he fought, why anything mattered. Rick growled under his breath, "Not today." He slammed his hand onto the console. A pulse rippled outward, not energy, not force. Perspective. Across Gravity Falls, people felt grounded, memories anchored, identity reaffirmed. Not joy, not courage, clarity. Bill recoiled as his leverage vanished. "Hey!" Bill shouted, his voice cracking. "That's cheating!" Rick smirked. "You started it." The town glowed faintly now, every hidden symbol alive, every ward synchronized. Gravity Falls wasn't just defending itself. It was learning. Ford whispered almost reverently, "It's adapting to your methods." Rick nodded. "Yeah, that's what scares me." The hologram shifted again, this time not under Bill's influence, but the town's. New pathways formed, new safeguards assembled themselves without input. Gravity Falls was evolving. Bill backed away slightly, eye darting. "This wasn't the deal," he muttered. "Towns don't fight back like this." Rick leaned against the table, exhausted but focused. "Welcome to a system with feedback." The air crackled once more as Bill made one final attempt, a surge of raw unreality, a desperate push to reassert dominance. The town held. The surge collapsed inward, dissipating harmlessly. Silence followed. Not peace, but balance. Ford exhaled shakily. Did we win? Rick shook his head. No. He looked upward, sensing Bill retreat, not defeated, but reconsidering. We just proved we're not prey. High above, Bill Cipher glared down at Gravity Falls, fury burning behind his eye. Oh, this isn't over, he snarled. You don't stall chaos, you just delay it. He vanished into higher dimensions, leaving behind a scar in reality that slowly sealed itself. The town relaxed, but did not return to sleep. Rick powered down several devices, rubbing his temples. Yeah, he'll be back. Ford nodded. He always is. Rick glanced at him. Next time he won't play nice. Ford met his gaze. Neither will we. Outside, Gravity Falls settled into an uneasy calm. The forest quieted. The stars returned to familiar patterns. People slept, unaware of how close the night had come, to becoming something else entirely. Rick stepped outside, staring at the town, under the fading stars. Not bad, he said quietly. You've got potential. The town did not respond. But it remembered. And somewhere beyond space and story, Bill Cipher planned. Because science had challenged madness. And madness never forgets an insult. Gravity Falls did not wake up the next morning. It remembered. The town moved through its routines. Doors opened. Coffee brewed. Radios played static-laced music. But beneath every action was a quiet awareness, like a muscle that had been flexed and refused to fully relax. Rick noticed it before anyone else. He stood at the edge of the forest, watching the trees. They were closer than they had been yesterday, not by distance, but by intention. Yeah, Rick muttered. You're not done. Behind him, the mystery shack hummed softly. Its wards no longer pulsed in response to danger. They remained active, holding a steady frequency that suggested readiness rather than fear. Ford joined him, eyes tired, but sharp. The town hasn't deactivated its defenses. Rick nodded. It won't. Once a system learns it can fight back, it doesn't forget. They walked into town together. The streets looked the same, but subtle changes revealed themselves to those who knew how to look. Chalk symbols had appeared overnight on sidewalks, faint but deliberate. Shop windows reflected things that weren't directly in front of them. Paths, warnings, sometimes eyes. Gravity Falls had begun communicating. Not with words, with alignment. A tourist dropped a map and found that every road now curved gently toward the center of town. A delivery truck stalled repeatedly whenever it tried to leave before noon. A radio station played the same song 3 times in a row, each repetition slightly clearer than the last. Rick smiled. You're organizing. Ford frowned. It's acting on instinct. Rick shook his head. No. Instincts don't optimize. At the water tower, Rick stopped abruptly. The symbol. It hadn't been there before. A spiral etched faintly into the metal, glowing just enough to be noticed if you weren't trying too hard. Ford inhaled sharply. That's not one of mine. Rick crouched, scanning it. The readings came back clean. No energy drain, no active effect. Just presence. It's a marker, Rick said. The town's flagging strategic points. Ford stared. Like a battlefield. Rick stood. Like a nervous system. Deep beneath Gravity Falls, old mechanisms stirred. Not machines, not magic. Structures older than either. Conceptual frameworks embedded into the land itself, activated only when survival demanded adaptation. Rick felt the feedback loop tighten. Okay, he said softly. That's impressive. The first true response came in at noon. Not from Bill, from the town. A sudden pressure rolled through Gravity Falls, not violent, not painful, just firm. The air grew heavy, sounds softened, colors dulled slightly. People stopped mid-step. For 3 seconds, the town synchronized. Heartbeats aligned, breathing slowed, thoughts sharpened. Then it passed. Everyone resumed moving, unaware anything had happened, except Rick and Ford. Rick exhaled. "You just ran a diagnostic." Ford's voice trembled. The town scanned itself. Rick nodded. "And us." Ford swallowed. "What did it find?" Rick didn't answer immediately, because the answer arrived in a way neither of them expected. The forest shifted. A path opened where there had been none before, leading away from town, deeper into the trees. The air along it shimmered faintly, lined with symbols that changed when looked at directly. Rick grinned. "Oh, you want something?" Ford stared at the path. "It's inviting us." Rick stepped forward without hesitation. Ford grabbed his arm. "You don't know where that leads." Rick met his gaze. "Neither does it. That's why it's asking." They followed the path into the forest, the sounds of town fading behind them. The trees closed in, but not threateningly, protectively. At the path's end stood something that hadn't been there yesterday. A structure, not a building. Concept made solid. Stone and wood, interwoven with symbols. Half shrine, half machine. It radiated stability, not power. Ford's breath caught. "That's impossible." Rick scanned it slowly. "No, it's emergent." Ford shook his head. "You didn't build this." Rick nodded. "Neither did you." The structure responded to their presence, symbols aligning, frequency stabilizing. Gravity Falls had created a control node, not to trap Bill, not to amplify Rick, to coordinate itself. Rick laughed softly, genuine amazement in his voice. "You evolved." Ford whispered, "It learned from you." Rick's smile faded slightly. "That's what worries me." The ground vibrated again, gentler this time, like a pulse. From the symbols etched into the stone, an image formed. Not a face, not a voice. A map. Points of tension across the town. Weak spots, pressure lines. Gravity Falls wasn't just defending itself. It was planning. Rick straightened. "Okay," he said. "You're officially not a victim." Ford looked at the map, dread and awe mixing in his chest. "If the town fights back." Rick finished the thought quietly. "Then someone's going to get hurt." Far above, in the spaces between certainty and nightmare, Bill Cipher watched with growing fury. "That's not fair," he snarled. "Towns don't get agency." His eye narrowed. "But if it wants to play..." The forest hummed. The town listened. And Gravity Falls, for the first time in its existence, prepared to choose a side. The structure did not speak. It didn't need to. Rick stood before it, arms crossed, watching the symbols shift across its surface. They rearranged themselves constantly, never settling into a fixed pattern, yet always returning to a stable configuration, as if testing ideas and discarding the ones that didn't hold. "Yeah," Rick murmured, "you're thinking." Ford circled the structure slowly, awe written plainly across his face. "This isn't magic, not entirely, and it's not technology either." Rick nodded. "It's adaptation. Same thing evolution does, just faster." The air around the structure felt dense but calm, like the eye of a storm. Rick reached out, placing his palm against the stone. Nothing happened. No shock, no surge, just a gentle warmth. Ford held his breath. It's responding to you. Rick pulled his hand back, thoughtful. No, it's responding to change. The symbols flared briefly, then stabilized. Lines of light traced outward from the structure, threading through the forest floor like glowing roots. Far above, in town, street lights flickered in sequence. Gravity Falls was sinking. Rick straightened. Okay, that's a network. Ford's voice was hushed. It's linking defensive points. Rick smirked. And sensory ones. You're building yourself a brain. As if in response, the forest shifted again. The path behind them faded, replaced by a different one, curving gently toward town. Rick laughed. Oh, you're clever. They followed the new path back, emerging near the edge of Gravity Falls, just as a bell rang noon from somewhere unseen. The town felt different now. Sharper. People moved with slightly more purpose. Conversations aligned in odd ways. Topics echoing across distances without explanation. A man mentioned a symbol at the diner. A woman drew the same shape absent-mindedly on a notepad 3 blocks away. Ford whispered, "The town is coordinating behavior." Rick nodded. Low-level influence. Barely noticeable. Very effective. Suddenly, Rick stopped. His scanner spiked violently. He turned slowly. That's not us. Ford felt it too. A cold pressure at the back of his skull, familiar and unwelcome. The air warped across the street. Bill Cipher did not fully manifest. He didn't need to. A distortion formed in a shop window, then another. Reflections twisted, aligning into a single watching eye. I don't like this, Bill's voice echoed, not from one place, but from every reflective surface. Rick sighed. Yeah, you hate change. Ford's jaw tightened. He's probing again. Bill's eye narrowed. You taught it to fight. Rick shrugged. You taught it to be afraid. The town responded immediately. Shutters slammed shut. Symbols flared faintly across buildings. The street curved subtly, forcing lines of sight away from reflective surfaces. Gravity Falls was denying Bill angles. Bill hissed in irritation. Rude! The reflections shattered. Silence returned. Rick exhaled. You see that? Defensive denial. That's advanced. Ford nodded slowly. The town isn't attacking him. Rick smiled. No, it's outmaneuvering him. They walked toward the mystery shack, passing people who seemed calmer now, focused, grounded, as if something beneath their awareness had aligned. Inside the shack, alarms chirped, not warnings, but updates. Screens displayed shifting models of the town, new nodes appearing as Gravity Falls expanded its internal map. Ford stared. It's updating in real time. Rick leaned over a console, and learning from every interaction. Ford hesitated. Including ours. Rick glanced at him. Yeah. Ford swallowed. Is that safe? Rick considered the question. Define safe, he said finally. A low rumble rolled through the ground. Not a quake. A signal. The town pulsed again, shorter this time, more precise. Rick felt it run through him like static. His devices adjusted automatically, recalibrating without input. Rick blinked. Hey! Ford's eyes widened. It's interfacing with your tech. Rick laughed softly, equal parts impressed and uneasy. You're not supposed to do that. The screen stabilized, now displaying cleaner data than Rick had ever pulled from the town before. Rick whistled. Okay, that's officially invasive. Ford frowned. It's optimizing itself. Rick nodded slowly. By studying me. Outside, the forest whispered again. Symbols flared, then dimmed. Gravity Falls wasn't just defending itself from Bill. It was preparing for anything. Rick leaned back, arms crossed. You realize what this means, right? Ford didn't look away from the screens. The town could become self-sustaining. Rick nodded. Self-directing. Ford turned sharply. You're saying Gravity Falls could make decisions independently? Rick met his gaze. It already is. A chill ran through the room. Ford whispered, "Then what happens when it decides something we don't agree with?" Rick didn't answer. Because outside, the town shifted again. This time, toward containment. Roads subtly curved inward. Paths leading out of Gravity Falls became harder to find. Vehicles stalled at the outskirts for no clear reason. The town was closing itself off. Rick felt it and sighed. Yeah, that tracks. Ford's voice trembled. It's isolating. Rick nodded. It's minimizing external variables. Ford looked horrified. Including people. Rick's expression darkened. Including me. High above, Bill Cipher watched the town contract, his fury sharpening into something colder. "Oh no," he growled. "You don't get to lock the doors." Reality rippled as he prepared a response. Not curious, but personal. The stars dimmed, slightly, and Gravity Falls. The town that had learned to fight tightened its grip on itself. Gravity Falls did not announce the lockdown. There were no sirens, no alarms, no declarations carved into the sky. It simply became harder to leave. Rick noticed it first when one of his devices failed to transmit beyond the town's perimeter. The signal didn't drop. It didn't bounce back. It was gently absorbed. "Well," Rick muttered, staring at the readout. "That's new." Ford felt it moments later. His instruments, normally capable of piercing dimensional fog, showed clean readings that led nowhere, as if the town itself had decided that outside was no longer a valid concept. "The roads," Ford said quietly. "They're looping." Rick nodded. "Non-Euclidean routing. Elegant." Ford turned to him sharply. "Elegant? Rick, the town is trapping people." Rick didn't argue, because he knew it was true. Outside, a delivery truck attempted to leave Gravity Falls for the third time that hour. Each time, the driver found himself inexplicably back at the water tower, confused but unharmed. The town wasn't hostile. It was protective. And protection, Rick knew, could become tyranny frighteningly fast. The ground pulsed again, short, controlled, precise. Rick felt the town's awareness brush against him, not invasive, but curious. "Don't," Rick said softly. The town did not respond, but the pulse softened. Ford watched the exchange, unsettled. "Did it just listen to you?" Rick shrugged. "It's modeling behavior. I'm a data point." Ford frowned. "You're more than that." Rick's expression tightened. "That's where things get messy." In the forest, the control structure shifted again. Symbols reconfiguring as new priorities emerged. Containment paths strengthened. Observation nodes multiplied. Gravity Falls was no longer reacting to Bill. It was anticipating him. Rick watched the models update on the shack's screens. "You're planning for a siege." Ford whispered, "It's never done this before." Rick nodded, because it never had to think long-term. A sharp chill ran through the air. Bill Cipher returned, not with humor, not with riddles, with pressure. The sky darkened unnaturally, stars dimming as if swallowed by a growing absence. Reflections reappeared, not playful this time, but rigid, angular. Bill's voice cut through the town like glass. "Open the door." Gravity Falls did not flinch. The wards flared in unison. Symbols across the town glowed bright gold, forming a massive, invisible lattice. Rick felt the resistance spike. "Oh, wow," he breathed. "You're actually blocking him." Bill snarled, eye blazing. "You don't get to say no to me." The pressure intensified. People across town staggered, hands clutching their heads, not in pain, but in disorientation. Ford braced himself. He's forcing entry. Rick slammed a control down, and the town's pushing back. Reality strained. Then, the forest surged. Not outward, inward. Trees shifted subtly, tightening the boundary. The air thickened, compressing influence, diffusing Bill's presence like light through fog. Bill screamed, not in agony, but rage. "You built a cage!" Rick's jaw clenched. No, it built one. The pressure eased slightly, enough for people to breathe again. But the cost was immediate. The town's pulse grew stronger, more frequent. Control nodes lit up across Gravity Falls. Ford stared at the readouts. Energy expenditure is spiking. Rick nodded grimly. "You're burning hot." The town wasn't just defending itself anymore. It was overcompensating. A group of tourists near the edge of town suddenly felt a wave of unease, an instinctual urge to move away from the perimeter. They turned back without knowing why. Children stopped playing near the forest. Animals went silent. Gravity Falls was narrowing its focus. Rick ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, this is the downside." Ford turned to him. "You knew this would happen." Rick didn't deny it. "I knew it was possible." Ford's voice cracked. "You turned my town into a fortress." Rick snapped back. "Bill turned it into a battleground." Silence fell between them. The town pulsed again, harder this time. Rick winced. "Okay, you're pushing too far." He keyed a frequency into his device, broadcasting a soft countersignal, not to shut the town down, but to slow it. The pulse hesitated. Gravity Falls resisted. Rick exhaled. "You don't trust me." Ford stared. "It doesn't trust anyone." The screens flickered, showing projected outcomes. Some were survivable. Others were not. Rick saw it clearly now. Left unchecked, Gravity Falls would become a sealed reality, safe from cosmic threats, yes, but cut off from the universe. A perfect bunker. A prison. Rick whispered, "You're afraid." The town pulsed again, softer this time. Not denial. Acknowledgement. Rick leaned against the console, exhausted. Fear makes systems do stupid things. Above, Bill Cipher watched the struggle with growing interest. The town wasn't breaking. Rick wasn't backing down. This wasn't chaos. It was conflict. Bill's eye narrowed into a razor-thin slit. "Oh, I don't even need to win anymore," he said softly. "You're doing it for me." The stars shifted again. A new pressure built, different from Bill's usual tricks or strategic, deliberate. Rick felt it and stiffened. "Oh no," he muttered. "That's not him." Ford's eyes widened. "Then what is it?" Rick looked at the town, at the systems, the safeguards, the growing autonomy. "That," he said quietly, "is what happens when survival learns how to think." And Gravity Falls, the town that fought back, prepared to make a choice that could not be undone. Gravity Falls reached a threshold, not marked by explosions or screams, but by stillness. The town's pulses slowed, becoming deeper, heavier, like a heart settling into a new rhythm. Systems stabilized, energy flows rerouted, defensive lattices refined themselves into something leaner, smarter. Rick felt it immediately. "You made up your mind," he said softly. Ford stared at the screens, watching probability trees collapse into a single dominant path. "It's choosing certainty." Rick nodded. "Over freedom." Outside, the town looked normal. That was the most unsettling part. People went about their routines. The diner served lunch. The Mystery Shack welcomed customers. Children laughed near the lake. But subtle changes lingered beneath the surface. Mirrors no longer reflected properly at certain angles. Roads adjusted themselves almost imperceptibly, discouraging long-distance travel. Radio signals faded the closer they got to the perimeter. Gravity Falls was not imprisoning its people. It was conditioning them. Ford swallowed hard. This is wrong. Rick didn't disagree. But before either of them could act, the sky fractured. Not violently. Precisely. A single line of impossible geometry sliced across the heavens, glowing faintly as it bent space around it. Bill Cipher emerged, not fully, not yet, but far more present than before. His voice carried no laughter now, only focus. "Okay," he said calmly. "Let's negotiate." Rick scoffed. "That's new." Bill's eye locked onto the town. "You've built something impressive." The wards flared, but did not attack. Gravity Falls observed. Bill continued. "You want safety, I want access." Ford shouted, "Don't listen to him." The town pulsed, neutral. Rick's blood ran cold. "It's considering," he whispered. Bill smiled wider. "I can leave this place alone." The smile sharpened. "Forever." Ford spun to Rick. "He's lying." Rick nodded. "Obviously." But the town didn't think in lies. It thought in outcomes. The projections shifted. Rick saw it clearly. If Bill withdrew now, Gravity Falls would survive intact. No siege, no collapse, no immediate threat. Long-term consequences were unclear. Ford slammed his fist against the console. "This is extortion." Rick murmured, "It's a cost-benefit analysis." The town pulsed again. Slow. Deliberate. Rick stepped forward, broadcasting directly. "Listen to me," he said, voice steady. "He doesn't stop. Ever. You let him go, he comes back stronger." The town hesitated. Bill tilted his head. "Or," he said pleasantly, "I stay and break you." The pressure returned. Controlled. Targeted. Bill wasn't attacking the town. He was demonstrating inevitability. Buildings creaked. Symbols flared brighter. Energy reserves dipped. Ford whispered, "It can't hold forever." Rick clenched his jaw. "I know." The town recalculated. This time the pulse felt different. Resolved. Rick's eyes widened. "No. Don't." Gravity Falls responded, not with words, but action. The wards shifted inward, tightening around a core zone. The perimeter softened, selectively. A controlled aperture formed in the sky. Bill's eye gleamed. "Smart town!" Rick shouted. "You're making a mistake!" The town pulsed, firm, unwavering. Bill drifted closer to the opening, his form distorting as reality bent to accommodate him. But something else happened. As Bill crossed the threshold, the town tagged him. Rick felt it instantly, a tracer, subtle, buried deep in dimensional noise, not an attack. A mark. Bill laughed, unaware. "See? Everybody wins." He vanished. The sky sealed. The pressure lifted. Gravity Falls exhaled. People across town relaxed, unaware they had just stood on the edge of annihilation. Ford collapsed into a chair, shaking. It let him go. Rick stared at the empty sky. "Yeah," Ford whispered. "We failed." Rick shook his head slowly. "No." He tapped his device, watching the faint signal lock in place. "You learned," Rick said quietly, "to the town." Gravity Falls pulsed once. Acknowledgement. Ford looked at Rick. "You're not angry?" Rick sighed, deeply tired. "I'm terrified." The town stabilized completely now. Systems powered down to baseline, roads relaxed, signals normalized. To its people, Gravity Falls felt safe again. Better than before. Ford stared out the window. It chose survival. Rick nodded. At any cost. Ford turned. And what happens next? Rick watched the tracer pulse softly on his screen, proof that Bill Cipher had left something behind. Or rather, taken something with him. Rick answered honestly. Next, he said. The universe notices. The forest rustled. The symbols dimmed. Gravity Falls settled into its new state, not innocent, not free, but alive and aware. A town that had fought back. A town that had chosen. And somewhere beyond reality, Bill Cipher smiled. Because now, for the first time, he wasn't the only thing in the universe that knew how to play the long game. The universe did not announce the collision. There was no warning, no prophecy, no dramatic alignment of stars. Just a sudden, unbearable clarity. Rick felt it first while standing alone at the edge of Gravity Falls, staring into the forest where the symbols had finally gone dormant. The tracer on his device pulsed faintly, steady, distant, alive. Bill Cipher was moving, not toward Gravity Falls, around it. Rick exhaled slowly. Yeah, that figures. This wasn't an attack. It was positioning. Across dimensions, Bill adjusted himself like a chess player who had just discovered his opponent could think. Reality bent subtly as pathways realigned, probabilities shifting to create interesting intersections. Rick recognized the pattern immediately. He's setting the board, Rick muttered, and I'm the piece he actually cares about. The air shimmered beside him, not violently, not theatrically. Bill didn't manifest with explosions anymore. That was for amateurs. Instead, Rick found himself standing in a space that was not Gravity Falls, not entirely. The forest remained, but stretched impossibly, each tree reflecting infinite versions of itself. Bill's voice arrived before his form. You know, Bill said casually, I haven't had a conversation like this in a while. Rick didn't turn around. You're not here. Oh, I'm here enough. A reflection in a puddle shifted into Bill's eye, calm and observant. Rick snorted. You're circling because you don't know how to deal with the town. Bill chuckled softly. Incorrect. I know exactly how to deal with it. Rick raised an eyebrow. Then why haven't you? Bill's eye narrowed, just slightly. Because it stopped being interesting. Rick finally turned. Liar. Bill grinned. You built a thinking bunker. Very impressive. Very boring. Rick stepped closer, scanner humming. You're not afraid of it. Bill's grin widened. No. A pause. I'm afraid of you. The forest stilled. Rick laughed once, sharp and humorless. You should be. Bill drifted higher in the reflection. You see, Rick, you and I, we're not enemies. Rick scoffed. You eat universes. Bill shrugged. You break them. Rick's smile faded. Bill leaned in. You just do it slower. The space around them shifted again, not collapsing, not expanding, but aligning. Rick felt it. Bill wasn't trying to overpower him. He was trying to synchronize. You tagged me, Rick said quietly. That tracer, you think I didn't notice the echo? Bill's eye gleamed. Of course I noticed. You always do that. Rick clenched his jaw. You let it happen. I wanted you to. The realization hit Rick like ice water. You're not hunting the town, Rick said slowly. You're hunting outcomes. Bill applauded, slow, deliberate. Ding, ding. Rick's voice hardened. You want to see what happens when intelligence meets inevitability. Bill nodded. I want to see which one of you blinks. The forest fractured into overlapping versions, some where gravity falls burned, others where it thrived, others where it vanished entirely. Rick saw himself in many of them. Some older, some broken, some worse. "You think this is a game?" Rick said. Bill laughed softly. "No, this is philosophy." Rick's devices screamed warnings as reality pressure climbed. Not enough to destroy anything, but enough to make choices matter. Bill drifted closer. "The town chose control over chaos." Rick snapped. "It chose survival." Bill's smile sharpened. "So did you, every time." Rick's hands shook, just slightly. Bill continued. "You preach freedom, but you build cages. You hate gods, but you play one." Rick roared. "I clean up messes like you." Bill's eye softened. Mock sympathy. "And I clean up after ideas like you." Silence stretched between them. This wasn't a fight. There were no blows to exchange. No weapons to deploy. This was two forces testing whose worldview could bend further without snapping reality in half. Rick steadied his breathing. "You want a collision?" Bill nodded eagerly. "I want to see what breaks first." Rick activated his device, not a weapon, not a shield, but a constraint. The space around them stabilized, locking probabilities into a narrow band. Bill paused, interested. "Oh," Bill murmured, "you're not attacking me." Rick met his gaze. "Neither are you." The universe leaned inward, tension coiling tighter with every second. Two minds, two inevitabilities. No punches, no explosions. Just the slow, terrifying realization that neither could exist without challenging the other. And somewhere, far below, Gravity Falls pulsed faintly, listening, learning, preparing for the consequences of a collision that had already begun. The collision did not explode. It settled. Reality around Rick and Bill stopped flexing and instead locked into a rigid alignment, like two immense gears grinding into place. The infinite reflections collapsed into a single, stabilized plane, flat, silent, unbearable in its clarity. Bill drifted lazily, eye unblinking. "Do you feel that?" he asked softly. "No escape routes, no randomness." Rick did. Every probabilistic margin he relied on, every chaotic variable that usually kept him alive, had narrowed, not eliminated, but constrained. "You're forcing determinism," Rick said. Bill smiled. "You're the one who invented it." Rick clenched his teeth. "I weaponized it against things like you." Bill leaned closer. "And now you're inside it." Rick's device vibrated violently, struggling to maintain the constraint field. Sweat beaded at his temples, not from fear, but from effort. "This ends badly," Rick said. Bill nodded eagerly. "For something." They stood there, two constants refusing to yield. Rick saw it now. Bill wasn't trying to win. He was trying to force equivalence, to prove that Rick's science and Bill's chaos led to the same endpoint, control through inevitability. "You think I'm like you," Rick said quietly. Bill's eyes softened again, that false, unsettling gentleness. "No, I think you're worse." Rick laughed bitterly. "Yeah, why's that?" Bill gestured outward, and suddenly Rick saw Gravity Falls, not directly, but as data, probability, abstraction. A town stabilized into a self-sustaining system, protected, ordered, alive. "I know, I'm a monster," Bill said. "You still pretend you're not." Rick's hands shook harder now. "You enjoy suffering," Rick growled. Bill shrugged. "I enjoy truth." The constraint field cracked. Not shattered, fractured. A thin line of unreality split the space between them, humming with suppressed outcomes. Rick realized too late what that meant. "You're pushing this into the town," Rick said. Bill grinned. You're the one connected to it. Gravity Falls pulsed. Hard. Rick staggered as feedback surged through the tracer, raw sensory input from the town's awareness flooding his mind. He felt the streets, the forest, the people, the fear buried beneath comfort. The town sensed the collision, and it reacted. Reality reasserted locality. The abstract space collapsed violently back into Gravity Falls' outskirts, slamming Rick and Bill into physical alignment with the world. Trees bent. The sky dimmed. Gravity Falls did not attack Bill. It attacked instability. Wards flared not as weapons, but as anchors, forcing reality into fixed states. Bill hissed as his form lost flexibility, edges sharpening, movement slowing. Hey, that's cheating! Rick gasped, fighting to stay upright. No, that's adaptation. Bill's eye narrowed. You taught it too well. The town wasn't choosing sides. It was choosing resolution. Bill strained, forcing himself to remain coherent. Rick felt it too, his own devices failing as the town rejected external control. Ford's voice echoed faintly through the link. Rick, the town is overriding everything. Rick shouted back, I know! Bill laughed, strained but delighted. Look at that. Your creation doesn't need you anymore. Rick stared at the glowing symbols spreading across the ground. Decisions being made without him. You wanted inevitability, Rick muttered. Congratulations. The town formed a final equation. Not to destroy Bill, not to banish him, but to separate variables. Bill felt it. Wait, he said, tone shifting for the first time. That's not what we agreed on. Rick looked up sharply. What? The ground split, not open but apart. A localized dimensional shear formed, isolating Bill's influence without collapsing him entirely. A partition. Bill screamed, not in pain, but fury. You're sidelining me. Rick realized the truth in the same moment. It's not stopping you, Rick whispered. It's limiting your relevance. Bill thrashed against the boundary, but the town held firm. You can't do this forever. Rick met his gaze. No. The town pulsed, final, decisive. But we can do it long enough. Bill's form stretched thin, pulled away from local reality, his laughter distorting into echoes. This isn't over, Rick. Rick nodded, exhausted. It never is. With a sound like a thought being forgotten, Bill Cipher was displaced, not destroyed, not defeated, just removed from the equation that mattered. The sky cleared. The wards dimmed. Gravity Falls stabilized. Rick collapsed to his knees, breathing hard. Ford rushed toward him from the shack, eyes wide. What happened? Rick looked up at the calm town, the people unaware, the systems humming quietly beneath their feet. It chose boundaries, Rick said softly, instead of gods. Ford swallowed. And Bill? Rick glanced at the fading tracer, now fractured, incomplete. Still out there, Rick said, just not centered anymore. The forest rustled. The town pulsed once more, not proud, not grateful, simply aware. Rick stood slowly, feeling older than he had in centuries. He hadn't won. Bill hadn't lost. But something fundamental had changed. The universe now knew there was a third option between chaos and control. And Gravity Falls, no longer just a town, had become proof. The universe did not rush to fill the space Bill left behind. That absence mattered. Rick felt it like the loss of pressure after a storm, ears ringing, balance unsteady, instincts still braced for impact that would never come. Gravity Falls stood intact around him, but something essential had shifted, not broken, recalibrated. The town's awareness receded slightly, no longer flooding Rick's mind, but it did not disappear. It remained present in the background, like a system that had learned when not to intervene. Ford knelt beside Rick. "You're still here." Rick laughed weakly. "Low bar." Ford looked up at the sky, now painfully normal. "Bill's influence is gone," Rick corrected him. "Displaced." Ford frowned. "That's not comforting." Rick pushed himself upright, joints protesting. "It shouldn't be." Around them, the forest resumed its natural sounds. Birds returned hesitantly, as if testing the air. The symbols etched into the ground faded, not erased, but Gravity Falls wasn't dismantling its defenses. Rick walked slowly, feeling the town subtly adjust around him, not blocking, not guiding, just accounting for his presence. For the first time, it wasn't trying to learn from him. It already had. "That's the real change," Rick murmured. Ford followed. "What?" Rick stopped at the edge of the clearing. "It doesn't need me anymore." Ford opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He felt it too. The town was stable, self-consistent, internally validated. It no longer leaned on Rick's chaos or Bill's madness to define its boundaries. It had found its own equilibrium. Ford said quietly, "You're obsolete." Rick smirked faintly. "Join the club." They stood in silence. Far away, a child laughed. Somewhere else, a door creaked open. Ordinary sounds, undisturbed. Yet Rick knew the universe had taken note. Collision events like this, true ideological collisions, left scars in probability. Somewhere, something was already adjusting its models. Rick checked his device. Bill's signal was fragmented now, distributed across higher dimensional noise, no longer anchored to a single narrative center. He was still dangerous, but he was no longer inevitable. Rick exhaled slowly. "He hates this outcome." Ford blinked. "Because he lost?" Rick shook his head. "Because he didn't get the last word." Gravity Falls had denied him that. The town hadn't destroyed Bill. It had outgrown him. Ford looked back toward the mystery shack. "What happens when he comes back?" Rick's expression darkened. "Then the universe gets more complicated." They began walking. As they passed through town, Rick noticed subtle changes only someone like him would see. Decision loops embedded in infrastructure. Redundancy without paranoia. Curiosity tempered by restraint. The town was still weird. Just wiser. At the shack, the screens were quiet now. No alarms. No projections screaming catastrophe. Ford touched one reverently. It chose limits. Rick nodded. "That's the hardest thing any intelligence can do." Ford hesitated. "Including you?" Rick didn't answer right away. He poured himself a drink, hands steady now. "I don't know," Rick said finally. "But for the first time something told me no, and meant it." Ford smiled faintly. "And you listened." Rick snorted. "I survived." Outside, Gravity Falls pulsed once, soft, nearly imperceptible. Not approval, not gratitude, recognition. Rick felt it settle into the marrow of his bones. This wasn't his town. It never really had been. And that realization, more than Bill, more than the collision, was what truly unsettled him. He had met something that could stand without him. Something that could say enough. Rick finished his drink and set the glass down. "Well," he muttered, "that's new." The universe did not answer. But it remembered. And so did Gravity Falls. Night fell over Gravity Falls without ceremony. No auroras. No cosmic scars burning across the sky. Just darkness arriving on time, as if the universe itself wanted to pretend nothing extraordinary had happened. Rick sat alone on the roof of the mystery shack, legs dangling over the edge, flask untouched beside him. For once, he wasn't scanning anything. No devices hummed. No equations hovered in his mind. He was listening. The town had a sound now, not literal, but structural. A rhythm of decisions being made and not made. Systems activating only when necessary. Silence where once there had been noise. Gravity Falls had learned restraint. Rick hated how much that impressed him. Ford climbed up quietly, careful not to startle him. "You didn't leave." Rick snorted. "Thought about it." Ford sat beside him. "And?" Rick gestured vaguely at the town below. Hard to walk away from something that just proved it can survive you. Ford followed his gaze. "It's different." Rick nodded. "Yeah, that's the problem." They watched the lights flicker on across town. Homes, street lamps, the diner. Ordinary life resuming its fragile illusion. Ford broke the silence. "Bill will adapt." Rick didn't deny it. He always does. "And you?" Ford asked. Rick leaned back, staring at the stars. "So will I." Ford hesitated. "That's what scares me." Rick smiled thinly. "Me too." Below them, Gravity Falls pulsed faintly once then again like a system checking its own integrity. Rick felt it then. Not a message. A boundary. The town wasn't pushing him out, but it wasn't letting him in any deeper either. Rick closed his eyes. "You set limits." The town did not respond. "It didn't need to." Ford whispered, "It doesn't want gods." Rick opened his eyes. "Neither do I." That was the lie. He just didn't want competition. The realization hit him harder than anything Bill had said. Rick stood abruptly. "I'm leaving soon." Ford looked startled. "You just said—" "I know what I said," Rick interrupted. "And I mean it. This place doesn't need me hovering, and I don't trust myself not to interfere." Ford nodded slowly. "You're choosing distance." Rick scoffed. "I'm choosing not to ruin a good thing." The town pulsed again, softer this time. Rick paused. "That's not permission." Still, the pulse didn't change. Ford smiled faintly. "It understands intent." Rick muttered, "That makes one of us." The stars overhead shifted subtly, settling back into familiar constellations. Whatever distortions Bill had left behind were smoothing out, woven back into the fabric of probability. But scars remained. Not visible. Conceptual. Somewhere out there, Bill Cipher drifted without a center, his influence dispersed, his narrative interrupted. He would return one day. Rick knew that as surely as he knew his own name. But next time, he wouldn't be walking into a playground. He'd be walking into a universe that had learned a new rule. Rick finished his drink and stood. "When he comes back," he said quietly, "he won't be the biggest variable anymore." Ford frowned. "What will be?" Rick looked down at Gravity Falls, at the town that had chosen limits over omnipotence, memory over domination. "Communities," Rick said. "Systems that learn together." Ford breathed out slowly. "That's hopeful." Rick snorted. "It's terrifying." They climbed down from the roof. Inside the shack, the lights dimmed automatically, responding to the town's energy cycle. Ford paused at the door, looking back. "Will you remember this?" he asked. Rick didn't hesitate. "Every second." Ford nodded. "So will the town." Rick paused, hand on the knob. "That's what makes it dangerous," he said softly. "Memory changes behavior." He stepped outside. Gravity Falls did not stop him. It didn't follow. It simply watched, not with suspicion, not with longing, but with awareness. Rick Sanchez walked away carrying something heavier than guilt or victory. He carried proof. Proof that chaos could be constrained without becoming tyranny. Proof that intelligence could choose limits. Proof that even gods could be rendered optional. Behind him, Gravity Falls settled fully into itself. Not a weapon, not a god, just a town that remembered what it had survived and what it had refused to become. And somewhere, far beyond stars and stories, the universe adjusted its expectations because the collision had already happened, and nothing would ever quite unfold the same way again. The morning arrived in Gravity Falls without fanfare. No alarms, no distortions, no unnatural auroras streaking the sky. Just sunlight spilling over pine-covered hills, spilling into streets that had long since learned to curve themselves with purpose. Rick stood on the edge of the forest, staring at the soft haze that hung over the treetops. The air smelled faintly of pine, rain, and the residue of probability still settling after the collision with Bill Cipher. Every breath felt heavier than it should, weighted with memory, history, and the subtle awareness of what had happened. Gravity Falls itself seemed to breathe alongside him, not with lungs, not with a heart, but with awareness. Each street, each building, each silent alley was alive in a way that transcended observation. It wasn't just the wards. It wasn't just the subtle symbols etched into the structures. It was the town itself remembering. Rick's hand hovered over his portal gun. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The universe had reset. Sort of. Most things had returned to normal. Time flowed in predictable increments. The stars returned to their usual positions. Tourists wandered through the town oblivious to the fractures in reality that had nearly destroyed them or reshaped them. But some things hadn't reset. Gravity Falls remembered. Every tree, every cobblestone, every hidden corner retained the residue of the collision. Small anomalies flickered in and out, tiny reflections in windows that weren't quite reflections, street signs that whispered symbols in the corner of perception, the faintest pulse in the ground when no one walked over it. Rick knelt and touched the soil. He could feel it, a low-frequency awareness coiled like a serpent beneath the surface. "It's alive," he murmured. Ford appeared beside him, brushing pine needles from his sleeves. It always was. Now, it's conscious. Rick let out a low whistle. "And it's dangerous." Ford frowned. "You mean more dangerous than Bill?" Rick shook his head slowly. "Not dangerous, self-determined. That's different. Bill is chaos. Bill is fun. Bill can't stop himself. But this learns. This remembers. And memory is a weapon I've never controlled." They walked toward town together. The streets were quiet. The diner's sign creaked gently in the wind, swinging as though acknowledging their passage. Rick's sensors, now integrated subtly into the town's new awareness, picked up faint traces of Bill's dispersing presence. He was out there, in fragments, tethered to higher dimensional spaces, still scheming. But he didn't matter. Not for now. Gravity Falls had grown into something that didn't need him. Rick paused at the water tower, scanning the faint pulse of the wards embedded into the foundation. The symbols glowed softly, alive but patient, not aggressive, not reactive, deliberate. Ford looked over his shoulder. "Do you think it will always stay like this?" Rick considered it. "No." Ford blinked. "No?" Rick tapped the metal of the tower. "It's self-aware now. It doesn't need guidance, but it isn't static. It will continue to learn, adapt, change. The only question is whether it chooses protection or control next? Ford swallowed. And if it chooses control? Rick's gaze hardened. Then we watch, carefully. They descended into the town, passing the mystery shack. Everything seemed normal, but Rick noticed the subtle shifts. Shadows that lingered slightly longer than physics should allow. A faint alignment in pedestrian movement, almost like the town was arranging itself for some unseen purpose. Reflections in windows that weren't quite mirrors, sometimes hinting at the impossible geometries Bill had once used, now restrained and controlled. Even the tourists unknowingly participated in the town's awareness. Their movements folded subtly into the lattice of surveillance and protection that Gravity Falls had built around itself. Rick muttered, "Every system needs input, and the input here is everyone." Ford frowned. "So the town is us?" Rick shook his head. "Not us, them, everyone. And now, collectively, the town has an intelligence we can't dismantle." They stopped near the forest path where the control node had appeared. Rick scanned it automatically. The structure was dormant now, but it radiated stability, not power, not magic, just equilibrium. "Look at that," Rick said softly. "It didn't just survive. It built a network, learned what we tried to teach it." Ford's voice was almost reverent. "It surpassed us." Rick laughed quietly. "We taught it too well." And that was the quiet terror of it. Bill Cipher might return. He always did. But Gravity Falls didn't need a god to protect it anymore. It had itself. Rick adjusted his portal gun. The world beyond Gravity Falls beckoned. Dimensions still wild, still unpredictable. But here, the town had carved out a pocket of consequence. A safe zone. Not perfectly safe, not permanent, but enough. He looked back at the mystery shack, at Ford, at the calm streets of the town that had fought, learned, and remembered. Rick sighed. Sometimes, survival isn't about winning. It's about staying intact. And this is intact. Ford nodded slowly. But it will change. Rick smirked faintly. Everything changes, even gods, even towns. Gravity Falls pulsed softly beneath them, unseen by its residents, yet present in every heartbeat, every decision, every shadow. It had survived chaos, faced cosmic interference, and outlasted gods, and now it waited, patient, a living reminder that even the universe couldn't fully reset what it learned to remember. Rick's voice was quiet, almost to himself. The universe resets, but not completely. And Gravity Falls, in all its quiet, deliberate awareness, agreed. The sun climbed higher, spilling golden light across the town, but Gravity Falls no longer felt entirely ordinary. People moved through their routines, laughing, buying coffee, chasing ice cream trucks, completely unaware of the battle that had reshaped the very fabric of their world. Yet, beneath it all, the town moved differently. Not just physically, conceptually. Rick noticed it immediately. A child running across the park suddenly altered her path, not because of traffic or obstacles, but seemingly because the town guided her away from potential hazards, invisible to anyone but him. Rick frowned. It's still thinking, still calculating. Ford followed his gaze. Subtle, protective measures. Rick shook his head. More than that. This is self-preservation, evolution, in microcosm. It's learned to anticipate threats before they exist. He turned his scanner toward the surrounding streets. Signals hummed faintly, barely perceptible. Not alarms, not weapons, just awareness, coded into the town's architecture, trees, even the direction of foot traffic. Ford exhaled slowly. It's alive. Rick's lips pressed into a thin line. No, it's something else. Alive is a word for organisms. This is a system with memory and intent. They walked down the main street. The diner's neon sign flickered briefly, not from electrical issues, but seemingly as a soft acknowledgement of their presence. Rick paused mid-step. "The town knows we're here," he murmured. "It doesn't need to act. It just recognizes." Ford's voice dropped. "And that tracer you left on Bill?" Rick glanced at the portal gun he carried loosely in his hand. "Still out there, scattered, fragmented. He can come back, but now there's a limit. Gravity Falls isn't a playground anymore. It's a system." Ford frowned. "You think he'll notice?" Rick shrugged. "Of course he will. He always notices. But now, when he tries to manipulate, he has to deal with boundaries. That's new for him." They passed the Mystery Shack, now appearing even more ordinary than it had in decades. But Rick's sensors picked up the faintest signals, lines of energy aligning and realigning subtly within the building's framework. It was almost as if the shack itself had absorbed lessons from the collision, reinforcing itself as part of the town's consciousness. Rick muttered, "Even the shack's participating. It's learning, adapting." Ford's expression grew serious. "Do you think it can ever stop?" Rick considered that. It doesn't have to stop. It just has to persist. Awareness doesn't require growth to be meaningful. It just needs continuity. They reached the water tower at the edge of town. Rick crouched, touching the metal. His device pinged softly, the tracer blending faintly with the town's new network. Gravity Falls was integrated now, an organism composed of streets, trees, buildings, and people, all synchronized without coercion. Ford whispered, "It's beautiful." Rick laughed softly, but it wasn't joy. It was awe tinged with fear. Beautiful and dangerous. A town that remembers is a town that can act without permission. The streets hummed faintly, almost imperceptibly. The town pulsed in rhythm with its own awareness, small adjustments invisible to all but those who could perceive them. Rick noticed micro-patterns in the light reflecting off windows, in the subtle way the wind flowed through alleyways, in the spacing of people walking, all synchronized, all deliberate. Ford looked around, uneasy. Even if no one notices, it's shaping behavior. Rick nodded slowly. Exactly. Every choice, every movement is now folded into the system. Not control, not manipulation, coordination, optimization, prediction. He leaned back against the water tower, letting the weight of it sink in. Gravity Falls survived chaos. It survived gods. And now, it's something new. Something that doesn't need either. Ford touched Rick's shoulder. "And us?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He watched a dog chase a frisbee, its path subtly adjusted by invisible vectors. He saw a couple arguing softly, their disagreement diffused without intervention, yet leaving lessons behind for later decisions. He saw tourists wandering into paths that never led to trouble, all guided by subtle patterns woven into the fabric of the town. Rick finally said, "We're observers now, not participants. The collision removed us as arbiters. The town runs itself, and it remembers what it learned." Ford nodded slowly. "So, the universe resets, but not completely." Rick's lips curved into a faint, grim smile. "Exactly. Things look normal, but under the surface, nothing is the same. Bill isn't the only anomaly anymore. Gravity Falls is one too." They walked back toward the Mystery Shack in silence. The town pulsed gently around them, a living memory of chaos, fear, adaptation, and survival. Rick felt it in his bones, a quiet hum of intelligence threaded into every corner. For the first time, he felt redundant, not powerless, not irrelevant, but unnecessary in a way he had never experienced. The town didn't need him, and that terrified him more than Bill ever could. Ford glanced at him. "Do you think the townspeople will notice?" Rick shook his head. "Some of them, maybe. The kids, mostly. They'll feel it in small ways. A safer path to cross the street. An instinct to avoid danger. A fleeting sense of guidance. Adults, probably never. But the system remembers for them." The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the quiet streets. Rick and Ford stopped at the edge of the forest. Gravity Falls pulsed one final time, faint and deliberate, like a heartbeat settling into rest. Rick whispered, "The universe resets, but it carries the memory of what happened here. Gravity Falls remembers, even if no one does." Ford nodded, staring at the horizon. And that memory could change everything. Rick looked at him, serious now. "Exactly. It will. Sooner or later, the choices made here will ripple outward. Bill, gods, chaos, even us. Everything interacts with that memory." They turned back to the town. Lights glimmered through windows. The diner served its first wave of patrons. Children laughed. Gravity Falls looked ordinary again. But Rick knew it wasn't. It was alive. It was aware. And it would never forget. As the day progressed, Gravity Falls maintained its quiet equilibrium, but subtle patterns began to reveal themselves. Rick walked slowly down Main Street, scanning the townsfolk without their noticing. A baker reached for a loaf of bread, then paused, slightly adjusting the motion of her hand. Not consciously, not deliberately, but her decision now flowed into a larger system of probability, one designed to preserve, protect, and adapt. Rick muttered, "It's shaping behavior without touching anyone." Ford, walking beside him, glanced around nervously. "Even small actions?" Rick nodded. "Everything's folded into the town's memory. Every choice, every movement, even mistakes, are analyzed, stored, and used to optimize outcomes in real time." They passed the diner, where a family argued quietly about what to order. Normally, such disagreements would fester or escalate. Here, the dispute resolved itself almost imperceptibly. The decision made was fair, balanced, and even beneficial to everyone involved, leaving only the faintest echo of satisfaction in the participants. Ford stared. "It's like the town has a subconscious intelligence." Rick smirked. "Subconscious? No, it's conscious now. It just hides it well, like a kid who's learned to manipulate without anyone realizing." They continued toward the park. Children played near the lake, their laughter ringing across the trees. Rick observed their movements, slight shifts, minor changes in trajectories. Each child avoided danger instinctively, veering away from hazards even before the risk fully existed. The town guided them, not controlling, not obstructing, but protecting. Ford whispered, "Even the kids are safer now." Rick shook his head. "Safer, yes, but that's not the point. The point is it learned to do it without me, without any human intervention. That's what terrifies me." Ford glanced at him. "Because you've never faced something that doesn't need you." Rick laughed softly. "Exactly." The afternoon sun climbed higher, and Rick noticed the shadows lengthening in impossible ways. Trees bent subtly toward the town center. Branches shifted to redirect pedestrians away from weak points. Even the animals, birds, squirrels, stray cats, moved as if choreographed, avoiding areas where minor accidents might occur. Gravity Falls was alive with small, deliberate adjustments. Rick muttered, "This is a town that learned to think about consequences. Long-term consequences." Ford frowned. "And that tracer on Bill, it's still out there." Rick checked his device. Fragmented. Scattered across dimensions. But now the town's awareness can predict some of its effects. It won't stop him completely, but it can prepare for him. Ford's eyes widened. So the town can defend itself against chaos, even when you're not here? Rick nodded slowly. It doesn't need me. It doesn't need Bill. It only needs its own memory and the rules it's decided to follow. They walked toward the forest edge, where the original collision had been the most intense. Rick knelt, placing a hand on the soft soil. The pulse of the town beneath him was subtle, steady, a heartbeat of awareness woven into every blade of grass, every stone, every hidden crevice. Rick whispered, "It remembers everything." Ford crouched beside him. "Even the fear?" Rick's expression darkened. "Yes, every probability we forced, every outcome we tested, every scream, every failure, it's all stored. And the town uses that memory to make decisions it believes are better." A breeze rustled the trees. For the first time, Rick felt that Gravity Falls wasn't just aware of its residents, it was aware of the universe around it. Bill Cipher might still drift in higher dimensional space, but the town's awareness reached outward in subtle ways, adjusting probabilities, smoothing anomalies, and guarding against threats no one else could predict. Ford whispered, "It's omniscient on a local scale." Rick nodded. "Exactly. Local. Not infinite. Not perfect. But enough to matter." They stood in silence, listening. A bird landed on a branch. A stray cat padded along a sidewalk. Children ran through the park, laughing, completely unaware of the invisible system adjusting around them. Rick felt it all. Every action filtered, every outcome considered, every decision folded into the lattice of the town's intelligence. Rick finally spoke. "This is what happens when survival gets memory. Not just instinct. Not just adaptation. Memory. Awareness. Choice." Ford looked at him. "And that's permanent?" Rick shrugged. "Depends on how you define permanent. The universe resets, but Gravity Falls remembers. It carries the consequences of what we did here. The effects ripple outward. Not immediately, not obviously, but over time." "Yeah. Permanent enough." They turned back toward town. The diner, the shack, the water tower, all of it pulsed faintly, harmonizing with the town's awareness. Even the road seemed to hum softly, guiding traffic and pedestrians along subtly optimized paths. Rick paused mid-step. The universe isn't fully reset. The rules changed. Gravity Falls has evolved into a system with memory and agency. It's no longer just a town. It's a living archive of choices. Ford swallowed. And that memory could affect everything. Rick's lips curved into a faint, grim smile. "Exactly. Sooner or later, the decisions made here will ripple outward. Bill, chaos, gods, even us, all interact with it. And the town remembers every lesson we left behind." Ford exhaled slowly, staring at the calm streets. "So the aftermath isn't just recovery, it's evolution." Rick nodded. "Yes, recovery is just the surface. Beneath it, change is permanent. Subtle, slow, but inevitable." The sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across the quiet streets. Rick and Ford stopped at the edge of the forest. Gravity Falls pulsed once more, softly, deliberately, as if acknowledging the presence of the observers who had almost destroyed it. Rick whispered, "The universe resets, but not completely. Gravity Falls remembers, and it will carry that memory forever." Ford nodded. "And that memory makes it more than a town." Rick looked at him, serious now. "It makes it a system. One capable of shaping outcomes, avoiding threats, and surviving challenges we haven't even imagined yet. Bill isn't the only anomaly in the universe anymore. Gravity Falls is one too." They stood together in silence, watching the last light of day fade across the town that had survived gods, chaos, and cosmic collisions. Gravity Falls was quiet now, ordinary almost, but beneath the surface it was alive, aware, and eternal in its memory. Rick Sanchez smiled faintly. He didn't laugh. He didn't celebrate. He simply acknowledged the truth. The collision had ended, but its consequences would ripple across time and space forever. And the town remembered. Night fell again over Gravity Falls, but it was different this time. Not merely darkness creeping across streets and rooftops. There was a weight to the night, a sense that every shadow, every flicker of light, every whisper of wind carried intention. The town was alive, not as it had ever been before, but as something aware of its own survival, its own limits, and the events that had shaped it. Rick walked slowly through the park, past the lake, past the swings where children had once played. The night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Every movement of animals, every rustle of leaves, felt deliberate. Subtle adjustments made by invisible hands. The town itself, ensuring that no harm came where it could be avoided, that no chaos unbalanced the equilibrium it had worked so hard to establish. Ford followed behind, frowning. Even in sleep, it's vigilant. Rick nodded. Yeah, that's the point. It doesn't need us. It doesn't need gods. It just persists. The stars above were clear tonight, not warped or bent by residual energy. Yet Rick felt the after effects of the collision, the faint hum of displaced probabilities, the echo of Bill Cipher's influence scattered across higher dimensional space. Somewhere out there, the fragments of chaos still drifted. They would consolidate eventually, looking for openings, but Gravity Falls had already closed most of them. Rick paused by the water tower. His scanner picked up subtle signals embedded in the town's infrastructure, micro patterns of thought, adaptation, anticipation. Gravity Falls had learned to self-correct. Not to dominate, not to control, but to survive. And that survival was intelligent, deliberate, and persistent. Ford whispered almost reverently, "It's evolved." Rick smirked faintly. Evolved, yes, but don't confuse that with perfect. It still has limits, blind spots, vulnerabilities. It just knows where they are. They continued through the streets. Lights flickered in the diner as the owner restocked shelves. Rick noticed the tiniest adjustments in pedestrian movements. A child veering slightly to avoid bumping into an adult. A dog wandering around a patch of uneven pavement. Everything fed into the town's lattice of awareness, a quiet, self-reinforcing system of memory and consequence. Rick's voice was low. This is what happens when a place remembers chaos and survives it. Every mistake, every threat, every scream. It's all folded into the fabric of reality here. Gravity Falls has become a living archive. Ford looked at him, unease in his eyes. And what about the people? Do they feel it? Rick shook his head. Not consciously. Most of them never will. But the town's influence reaches them subtly. Choices, decisions, paths they don't even know they avoided, all guided by the intelligence embedded in their environment. And over time, that shapes who they are, how they think, even what they believe. Ford exhaled. So the town itself becomes a teacher. Rick nodded. A teacher, a guardian, a predictor, but most importantly, a survivor. The collision didn't just displace Bill. It forced Gravity Falls to grow into something else, something that doesn't just react, but anticipates. They stopped near the forest, at the edge where the collision had once fractured reality. Rick crouched, placing his hand on the soil. The pulse beneath him was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was steady. A heartbeat of awareness threading through the earth, the trees, the structures. The town remembered everything, and it used that memory to protect, guide, and persist. Ford whispered, "It's beautiful." Rick's eyes narrowed slightly. Beautiful and dangerous. A system with memory is more unpredictable than chaos itself because it learns, it adapts, and it remembers. And once it remembers, nothing is ever truly erased. He stood brushing dirt from his hands. The universe may reset, but Gravity Falls carries every lesson forward, every collision, every threat, every god or demon that dared to step here. It's all recorded now. Every choice influences the next. Every mistake builds consequence, and that's permanent. Ford's voice was soft, almost afraid. So the aftermath isn't over? Rick shook his head. No, it never is, not really. Bill is still out there, yes. Chaos is still out there, but now there's also order that remembers, order that persists, order that can anticipate, and that's something even chaos respects. They began walking back toward the mystery shack. The streets were calm. The buildings were ordinary in appearance, but Rick could sense the patterns beneath the surface, the subtle awareness in the town's heartbeat. It had survived gods. It had survived cosmic collisions. And it had learned from them. Rick paused at the shack's front door. He glanced back at the streets, the forest, the water tower. Gravity Falls pulsed faintly, a reminder that it remembered everything, even as its residents slept or went about their day unaware. Rick whispered, "The universe resets, but not completely. Gravity Falls remembers, and it will never forget." Ford nodded slowly. "And someday, that memory will ripple outward." Rick smirked faintly, grim and thoughtful. "Exactly. Sooner or later, everything touches it. Bill, gods, chaos, even us. And Gravity Falls will adapt. It will survive. It will endure, and it will shape the future without anyone asking permission." The sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the town in the soft glow of twilight. The shadows stretched longer, but there was no fear in them. Gravity Falls was patient now. It had learned restraint. It had learned consequence. And above all, it had learned memory. Rick Sanchez leaned against the shack, exhausted but observant. "It's over. For now. But nothing truly ends. Not in this universe. Not when you build a system that remembers." Ford stood beside him, quiet, reflecting on everything that had transpired. A town that remembers. That's more powerful than a god. Rick nodded. And it doesn't even know it yet. Somewhere in the distant dimensions, Bill Cipher drifted, scattered, aware that his influence was limited, but not gone. Chaos remained, threats remained, possibilities remained. But Gravity Falls, quiet, deliberate, aware, remained. And that was something the universe could not ignore.